My name is Lydia X Brown, and I'm an attorney, advocate, community organizer, educator, strategist, and thinker and writer on disability rights and disability justice. For over 10 years, my work has focused on interpersonal and state violence, targeting disabled people at the margins of the margins, especially disabled people living at the intersections of disability, race, class, gender, sexuality, language, and nation. Like all disabled people, it's impossible to say that there was one instance in which I suddenly became aware of inaccessibility or exclusionary practices in social life, because my entire life has been shaped by the forces of ableism. Like most other autistic people, I experienced bullying throughout my childhood and in schools, and I experienced a disconnect between the ways that I moved through the world and the ways that people around me who were largely not autistic moved through the world. But I will say that one of the times that I became most aware of grave injustices targeting other disabled people were a series of incidents that were widely publicized when I was in high school. And in all of those instances, young autistic people were criminalized, taken out of their schools, often charged in adult criminal court for simply existing while autistic. In many of those cases, the autistic students in question have been subjected to prolonged restraint and seclusion, sometimes for hours, before they were the ones who were charged with assaulting the teachers in the schools in the first place. Some of those students were white, others were Black, brown, or other people of color. And in all of those cases, the sentiment that came most broadly and clearly through public reporting on the incidents was that these were kids who had to be managed or controlled, instead of here are kids who have been targeted on the basis of disability discrimination. That to me was a very clear indicator of just the beginning of how pervasive and how awful violence against disabled people is, especially those who are multiply marginalized. In the cases of many of the white students, if they were unlucky, they might have been forced out of their school. But in the cases of the Black and brown disabled students, some of them were sentenced to prison terms of years. Others were killed outright. Although the ADA was passed and signed into law 3 decades ago, government agencies, individual organizations, and even and especially disability advocacy organizations flagrantly and blatantly violate the ADA's most basic provisions. Government agencies that are required to support disabled people and provide and enable access for disabled people routinely disregard those obligations. Private corporations and nonprofit organizations do much the same. Colleges and universities do not respect their disabled students. Corporations do not respect their disabled employees. Writ large in society, although the law has changed, the values that we hold and the beliefs that we have as an entire society have not changed at all, because you can't legislate morality. You can pass the best laws on the books, and even if you somehow monitor and enforce them, it doesn't mean that you've actually changed the ways that people think and talk about and understand and react toward and act about disabled people and disability in society. So when I think about ways that the ADA has fallen short, it's not necessarily just what is the language of the ADA, but it is how individual advocates, it is how courts, and it is how those with positions of power and access to privilege and resources choose to act or not act upon the ADA. And you see that everywhere. The disability organizations that have the most access to power, privilege, and resources generally advocate only for the interests and the issues that affect those who already hold the most privilege in disabled communities. That is, they care deeply about issues that primarily or only affect disabled people who are white, who are moneyed, who are degreed, who are otherwise considered palatable. But for disabled people who are at the margins of the margins, for disabled people of color, for disabled people that are generationally low income, for disabled people who are undocumented or have other immigration status other than citizenship, for disabled people who belong to minority religions, for disabled people who are queer or trans, for disabled people who cannot work in the ways that are expected under capitalism, those issue areas of inclusion in the corporate workplace, or the ability to access swimming pools in a hotel, or the ability to bring your service animal on a plane, can be important, but are often not affecting our lives in the same daily ways as they do those who have infinitely more privilege. And so where I see the gaps are, where are the folks who have power, privilege, and resources in talking about the right to Black and Brown disabled students to AAC? Where are those folks in thinking about the horrific violence inflicted on largely Black and Native disabled people in carceral systems? Where are those same people in looking at the ways in which police destroy the lives of sex workers and people who are using criminalized drugs, who are not white, who do not come from upper middle class or upper class families and neighborhoods and communities? Where are those folks in thinking about the ways in which universities not only prevent disabled students in general from accessing supports and accommodations, but put the brunt of that violence most predominantly on queer and trans disabled people of color, and even force disabled students, especially those that are multiply marginalized, out of the university altogether, or prevent them from ever beginning to access the university in the first place? Where are those same advocates when thinking about not just how are disabled people in the US represented or not represented in media or in electoral politics, but what about the ways in which the United States inflicts and causes disability globally through our wars, through our imperialism, through our colonization? To even begin to think about what equality looks like, which is itself a fraught term, because I don't actually want to be equal under capitalism or equal under white supremacy, but to think about what maybe justice would look like, what equity would look like actual equity, not corporatized, co-opted notions of equity, what freedom would look like, requires us to imagine a world that is so radically different from the one that we live in now. We need to be pushing as hard as we possibly can for money to go directly back into the hands of directly impacted community members and out of harmful systems like the foster system, police, prisons, coercive mental health care. We need to be demanding a return of resources and a return of power, and that is a ceding of power by non-disabled people, by white people, by those who have hoarded and controlled the most amount of power and privilege and resources, and done so at the direct expense of disabled people at the margins of the margins. And that has to start within our own organizations. Disability nonprofits are notorious for being so often white-led or predominantly white-led, and sometimes only white-led, for being male-led, for being led by people who are either not disabled at all or have what are considered palatable disabilities. And that needs to change. And the only way that will change is if those people who occupy those positions of power agree to give up that power. Not to be told you don't have a voice, to be very clear, to be told your voice doesn't have to be the one that's in charge and holds all the power.